See, there's something within us that wants to leave a legacy. But here's the thing you need to know is if God asks you to do something, don't look at the size of the job, look at the size of your God who asked you to do it. See, he laid down his life for you, so that tells me that you are not worthless, you are worthy. And this is what he wants to rewrite into your story. That reality impacts everything.
Well, welcome small groups. It's good to have you with us once again. Let me just, before we dive into week 8, final week of Mistaken Identity, just want to throw something out there to you. We are approaching Easter. I know that it's still a couple months away, but I just want to address something quickly. And that is, we're looking forward to Easter because we're expecting one of probably the highest attended weekends here at Lakeland, perhaps in our entire history. And with that, we're thrilled that people will be coming, but a more important win would be if we could get them connected. We know, just like you've already figured out, you're in a group, that being in a group is one of the best things for your walk with God. And so that's what we are concerned about making happen. And you're probably thinking, good, way to go, way to be passionate about small groups, us too. Well, here's where I want to actually speak to some of you who are sitting right now in the room, specifically the participant. Those of you who might have been, you've attended a small group, you've enjoyed the luxury of being in a great small group and have just, it's been important in your journey with God. I want to challenge you to consider stepping out and stepping up to help meet that need of all those people who will be coming, that we could get them into small groups, that perhaps it's time for you to lead your own small group. If that's something that, even as I say it, maybe it makes you a little nervous, a little kind of giggly nervous inside to think like, no, that's not me, but perhaps it's actually the Spirit saying, yeah, it's perhaps time that you step out and step up. I would highly encourage you to reach out to Pastor Jeff. He oversees our small groups here. Jeff at lakeland.church. We've got some things coming up to just actually get people prepared to do that well. And so if that's something that stirs within you, definitely follow up with him ASAP, okay? All right, let's dive into week 3 here of Mistaken Identity. This final week, we're not doing a versus thing, this versus that, fear versus faith, or fruit versus flesh. We are looking at the hidden minds of identity. It's these things that in life you can feel like, I'm doing really well. I feel like things are good in life. And then all of a sudden you come across something that seems to make you self-destruct, or your identity self-destruct. And are there some things, some behaviors and beliefs that might be an indicator that, watch out, you're actually setting yourself up perhaps for destruction? So here was my main point, is this. Why? It's really a question. Why do many self-destruct? And here was the main point. Beware of the behaviors and beliefs often hidden below the surface. These ignored landmines, and I say ignored because sometimes it's like we're semi-aware they're there, but then we don't deal with them. These ignored landmines of identity often set one up for self-destruction. So where are these mines, and why do many people self-destruct? And this weekend, what we did is we looked at really one person's kind of self-destruction. And I know it's kind of sad or maybe disappointing to kind of look in at someone falling apart, but there's a lot we can actually learn from that. And so we looked at the fall of David, and what were some of the things that he ignored that were, I think, part of these hidden minds that can actually be good learning tools for us. And so let me just give you, I identified 6, so I'm going to go through these really quickly, just a review for us here. The first one was this. First mine, to just kind of be aware of, buried minds of identity: isolation and a lack of accountability. Isolation and a lack of accountability. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1, I know you heard me say this if you were here with us this weekend, but it's this verse where it says, in the springtime, when the kings go off to war, David stayed home. David sends out the army. He sends everyone else out to do something, and he's the king. When kings go out to war and he's not there, he chose to stay home. And because he's staying home, he's not really where he should be, and he's in isolation, he's alone, and he sets himself up with a lack of accountability to actually fall into what he's about to fall into. And I don't know for you, if you've ever found yourself in isolation, in an unhealthy maybe relationships, or away from healthy relationships. Sure, there might be some freedom in being alone, but there's no accountability. there. And there's no one close enough to kind of call out your stuff if you've ever been there in a place of isolation. And here's one of the things that I have discovered is I know the devil's a liar. And in isolation, we don't check our thoughts. It's like we don't check our thoughts with other believers or even the Word of God at times. And it's easy to fester in a lie when you're alone. And so isolation, a lack of accountability often sets you up for a fall. And so maybe a simple question to ask yourself is this: who's in your life who can ask you the really hard questions? Or does anyone have a voice to challenge you or call you up in your life? Second one was this: pride and power. Beware of pride and power. So David, you probably recall this story. I'm not going to read all the verses to us, but he sees Bathsheba bathing on the rooftop. And then he sends one of his servants to go find out who she is. And so when they come back, they report that, well, this is Uriah the Hittite's wife. And it's in this place that he actually calls her to the palace, and then he sleeps with her. And for me, I look at it and I go, I wonder if David, if he just thinks he's untouchable. He has such pride and power. He does have a lot of power, but I want to argue that he's probably drunk in his own pride and power, and he's lost sight of other people, other people's feelings. And I think pride and power can set us up really to do some of the dumbest things, some of the stupidest things, because you're so indulged in self, and you just don't even see it. And so pride and power, second thing to just kind of be aware of. Third, is this: when your character doesn't measure up to your success, your leadership, or your level of influence. And sorry, I read that out of order. But when character doesn't measure up to your leadership, influence, or level of success. So David has Uriah. Ultimately, Uriah is Bathsheba's husband. After he sleeps with her, he finds out she's pregnant, and he has Uriah come home. And his whole hope is to have Uriah sleep with his wife, with Bathsheba, and then he'll think that Bathsheba, the pregnancy is his. And what's crazy is that Uriah demonstrates a level of character or integrity that we really wish David would demonstrate at this point. Uriah refuses to go home. He says, listen, as long as my commander and the army is sleeping in tents, that's where I'm going to be. There's no way I'm going to go home and make love to my wife when they are currently at war. And Uriah actually demonstrates this great level of integrity and character. But most people, here's the deal, when we think about just generally people in life, most people want success, right? I mean, you want success, you want to be successful, all of us want that. But here's the deal, you actually really don't want it if you don't have the character to handle the weight of your success. See, with success requires actually greater character, greater integrity, because with success comes influence, it comes power, stuff like that. I've heard this illustration, I've used it a couple times, maybe often kind of in one-on-one conversations, but this idea of something being the size of an elephant on the structure of a dog. Sometimes it gets used in regards to organizations, like beware of an organization growing to be the size of an elephant on the structure of a dog. Like maybe an organization that all of a sudden has a mass influx of people requesting a product and they're ordering the product, but the business doesn't have the infrastructure to keep up with the number of orders. Their structure size is the size of a dog, while they've got this great success the size of an elephant. And what always ends up happening is that individual or that organization ends up being crushed. And the same is true in our journey in life, is if your character, your foundation below the surface, does not keep up with your level of success and influence, you will be crushed. And so just keep your eyes open. Ask yourself this: are you bending on any small things right now? Because if you bend on the small things, you'll break on the big things. And so just kind of keep that in mind. Fourth, hidden sin. So what David does next is he's trying to get Uriah to sleep with his own wife, with Bathsheba. Uriah doesn't. And so David's got to cover up his sin, his mistake. And so he actually has Uriah killed, but kind of in a staged, event where in battle, he says, put Uriah out at the front where the fighting's the fiercest, and then have the troops back off and Uriah will get killed. And that's exactly what happens. And so while David really ultimately has this man killed, he thinks he's kind of getting away with it. And what he's doing is he's trying to hide and cover up his sin. And here's the deal. The reality is the moment sin is revealed is really the moment that you're actually going to find freedom. But what we often do is we're often trying to cover up our sin. What we do is we just are scrambling so often to keep sin hidden and covered, while the opposite is actually true. The sooner it's revealed is actually the sooner you're going to find freedom and you're going to start your process of healing. You know, I know in my life, I've dealt with hidden sins in the past, and I've shared this even with our congregation. The day that I found freedom was the day that I told my wife, my best friend, and my boss all on the same day. It was the greatest day of my life when I would reveal, on the day that I revealed hidden sin in my life. It was the day that actually started the healing and the freedom process. For me, there's nothing that will drain your soul more than maintaining hidden sin. It will always lead to self-destruction. So for you, just start asking yourself, do you need to bring some hidden sin into the light today to start really that process of healing and freedom? Fifth, belief in a lie or twisted truth. And this is ultimately what David does, is he has Uriah killed, and then he takes Bathsheba to be his own wife. And after all this is done, I think David is believing that, I think he's believing his own lie. I think he believes, I just got away with it, and this is good. This worked out for everyone's benefit. Sometimes what happens is we start believing lies or even twisted truths, and these twisted lies will ultimately destroy you. In this case with David, I think one of the twisted truth here is that he has enjoyed so much of God's favor over the years. I really think he's believing, you know what, God is just with me. God's favor is upon me. Like, I can't do anything wrong that God's not with me. And I wonder if he's actually taken a truth and twisted it, that God's favor is upon me, and twisted the application, assuming God will be upon this as well. His favor will be upon this. And the opposite was totally true, that God was not with David in this sinful act. And so sometimes what we do is we believe a small lie, or we even twist a truth. It's something about God that is true, but the application of it is wrong. And thus it actually provides space for the enemy to get a stronghold in us that will ultimately produce destruction. And so you've got to start, first off, you got to have friends in your life who can call it out. You got to know the Word of God accurately and know God's truths to say, all right, am I interacting with the truth of who God is and how I would live in obedience to Him, or am I twisting that in some way? Final one that I wanted to point out is this, is a non-teachable spirit. And this is actually David's redeeming value here, is that while David makes all these mistakes, the greatest thing that he actually does do and that he carries is he actually does carry a teachable spirit. When Nathan the prophet calls David to the mat and says, "You have sinned," David replies to him in this way. This is 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 13. He flat out owns it, and he says, "I've sinned against the Lord." And then he writes actually a very famous psalm that many of us have probably read, Psalm chapter 51, where he says this in verse 17, "My sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit. A broken and contrite heart, God, you do not despise." He's ultimately saying there, listen, of all things that God longs for is he longs for humble, teachable spirits. And this is what David brings. And because he brings this, he actually doesn't lose everything. He probably would have lost everything, but he comes with a very teachable spirit, a humble heart, and God doesn't strip his entire kingdom from him. There is some punishment that goes with his sin that David actually ends up having to deal with. But God actually is very gracious to David because of his teachable spirit. And so here's the deal for all of us. I think you know this to be true, is that marriages and individuals, you don't just blow up overnight. It happens in slow, small ways. And what if there were little things that we could keep our eyes open for, kind of these landmines that if we kept our eyes open, we might be able to identify them now And that's my hope here this week, is that we're just identifying them, and that this week that you and with your small group leaders, and as you prayerfully consider these things, that God helps you now disarm these minds in your own life. Because we know that marriages and individuals don't crash overnight. Casting Crowns, they wrote a song a handful of years ago, and while they're not my favorite band, the lyrics to this song called Slow Fade are actually really accurate in terms of how we sometimes self-destruct. It happens slowly. In the song, the lyrics are this: it's a slow fade when you give yourself away. It's a slow fade when black and white are turned to gray. You know, people don't crash in a day. It's these small minds that are hidden below the surface, that are ignored, that ultimately turn to self-destruction and us not walking in our true identity in Christ. So as you dive into your discussions today, I would just encourage you, perhaps there's going to be one or two of these minds that you're going to say, that's a mind that I think I'm flagging right now, that I want some help. Maybe some people in our small group, a couple of individuals or a friend, or to build a plan about how are we going to disarm this one in my life, because I don't want it to be something that causes my identity to self-destruct. So enjoy your conversation, and we'll see you guys next week.